today, we would like to say a very big thank you to Informatica for sponsoring today's webcast and let you all know that Informatica is the world's #1 independent provider of data integration software. Organizations rely on Informatica to realize their information potential and drive their top business imperatives. Informatica Vibe, the industry's first and only embeddable virtual data machine, powers the unique Map Once, Deploy Anywhere capabilities of the Informatica platform. Vibe harnesses data in every application, every process for every person, and in every device in the world. Organizations around the globe depend on Informatica to fully leverage their information assets from devices to mobile to social to big data residing on-premise, in the cloud, and across social networks. Thank you again, Informatica. Folks, today we are thrilled to have Susan Etlinger with us, and she is going to talk to you about Canary in the Coalmine, how social data can prepare us for big data. Susan is an industry analyst at Altimeter Group, where she works with global companies to develop social data intelligence strategies that support their business objectives. Susan has a diverse background in marketing and strategic planning within both corporations and agencies. She's a frequent speaker on social media and analytics and has been extensively quoted in outlets including Fast Company, BBC, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Susan is also one of our Strata Conference speakers, and she will be speaking at our sold-out conference next week, folks. We're really excited to have her with us today to present this webcast for you all. Okay, folks, first I would like you to open your group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we can interact with each other and where you can submit your questions for Q&A for Susan. We find that our audience usually has a lot of good knowledge to share, so we encourage you to chat freely during the event. However, if you have questions for Susan, please preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that they're for her and we can make sure we see it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you'd like to tweet from the Twitter widget today, you might need to give it permission to access your account. The Twitter widget will automatically append the event's hashtag to your tweet so you don't have to. And today our hashtag is StrataConf, all one word. If you should have any trouble with the event, please take a look at your help widget. If you continue to have trouble, just post it in the group chat and one of our staff will help you right away. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, try refreshing your window. And remember, the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is to close any apps that could interfere. People always ask, so we'd like you to know we are recording today's webcast, and we will have the archive ready usually within 48 hours. And folks, at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Susan for her presentation. Hello, Susan.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining this morning. I'm really looking forward to talking about this with you and kind of giving you a preview of some of the things that we've been working on and some of the trends and issues that we're seeing in the industry. So I'm going to go through the agenda really quickly. I'm going to start with just a little bit of an overview of what's going on with social analytics, and then I'm going to talk about making social data actionable and kind of how organizations, primarily large enterprise organizations, are taking social data and filtering it through the business and making strategic decisions based upon it. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about maturity and how we get to a data-driven organization, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's next. So with that, I want to give you a spoiler alert. Social data is big data. It fulfills the 3 V's criteria that Gartner Group came up with. There's actually some very important work behind this. You probably can't read the link at the bottom in detail, but I would encourage you to take a look at it, because if you're dealing with social data and you expect that you will be dealing with other types of big data, then it's important to kind of know how this thinking began. And I have to credit some analysts who were originally at Metagroup, including Doug Laney and then a gentleman named John Massey, who actually came up with the 3Vs definition, and then Doug built upon it when he was at Metagroup, and then they were subsequently acquired by Gartner. So it's really important because it really characterizes a lot of the things that we're seeing with social data that we haven't necessarily been able to give a name to. So there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of thinking behind this, but just for the purposes of our talk today, social data fulfills the 3Vs. Okay, so the 3Vs criteria means volume, so there's a ton of it, and then velocity, it moves very, very quickly, and you can imagine that when you think about metrics like tweets per minute and tweets per second, that we're talking about very, very fast-moving data. And then the real kicker here in terms of social data is actually the variety piece. And you think back to like 1999 or 2000 when some of these original concepts began to be developed, it's clearly pre-internet, or at least pre-broad use of internet, right? So the kinds of data they were talking about at that point in terms of volume and velocity were things like stock transactions. So you imagine, for example, that on a busy stock day you're talking about, tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of transactions occurring simultaneously and then happening very, very quickly, especially in a fast market. Now, the place where social kicks in here a little bit and where we see a lot of difference in terms of the kinds of data that have come before and that also create a lot of the challenges that we're seeing now is in the variety piece. So when you think about social data, it could be a tweet, right? So that's narrative, natural language. Or it could be a +1 or a like or a share, all of which are essentially buttons on a social platform or a pin. It could be a video, in which case you have access to some of the metadata, but not necessarily the ability to interpret what's actually in the video. Same goes with images or sound files. And so there's a lot of variety to social data. And so I wanted to kind of start off by clarifying this because when you're doing social data, you are doing big data, and that is how it prepares us. Now, here we go to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're seeing in terms of our research. We are seeing social data be used across large organizations, and here we define organizations, large organizations, more than 1,000 employees. But really, in most cases, we're talking about 500 million to $1 billion plus in revenues. And we're talking about organizations that have, a significant number of departments. And, the list here, the top of the list is not too surprising. Obviously, marketing and corporate communications are the primary use cases that we're all familiar with. Customer support, of course. Digital, of course. Then we move into social media. What's interesting here is that social media people don't necessarily need to be engaging, right? They can also be doing other things like interpretation or analysis. And then we see HR and product development and various other things going on, IT, executives, legal. That's really interesting because I have a case study coming up that I'll talk to you about, in which case the legal department is a huge proponent of social data and social media because it's helping them identify fraud. And then market research. Now these numbers are going to change pretty quickly, so if you don't see your department there, for example, sales is wrapped in somewhere, don't fret because clearly this data just shows that we're talking about proliferation, not that there are departments that aren't yet using it because really the reality is that it's all over the place. And this is your sort of new stakeholder list. Now the other thing I wanted to talk about is in some of the research that we did that was published this summer, we started to want to understand, okay, so all the social media is happening and organizations are doing it and they have lots of accounts and all this kind of stuff, but are they actually using social data in the context of other enterprise data? So for example, business intelligence and CRM and market research and various other departments within the organization. Certainly email marketing. You saw, for example, that Salesforce acquired ExactTarget not too long ago. And so they want to understand this. And I'm going to talk a little slowly because I want to make sure that the audio doesn't get too choppy here. But Yasmina, if you hear an issue, just ping me and let me know, and then we'll figure it out. But anyway, in terms of the social data, what's happening now and what you'll see with other types of big data streams over time is that organizations really want to understand, is social having an impact on the business, or can social maybe give us a little bit more perspective on what's happening on the business? And so don't take these numbers as total gospel, because the sample sizes are pretty small. And the reason that the sample sizes are pretty small is because the organizations who are doing this, who are trying to create some sort of integration, are very few, but the ones who are doing it are very, very sophisticated in terms of the way they're approaching it. And I also want to be clear for any of you IT folks in the audience that we're not talking necessarily about a strict technical integration, including, say, a social data warehouse and that sort of thing. In many cases, we're talking about integration from a conceptual point of view, meaning that people are looking at one dashboard, for example, market research, the results of a survey, and then looking at another dashboard, for example, a social listening tool and the results of a sentiment analysis, and they're trying to understand, is there a relationship between the two? Clearly, the next step is for them to start to integrate the data technically, and we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming year. And we're also going to see a lot more of that as the tools become more sophisticated in terms of their ability to make social data enterprise class. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the ecosystem, because social data is developing a very large, very diffuse ecosystem. Now, this is a bit of a complicated slide to look at, but just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here, at the very top, publishers, in other words, publishers of social data, or what you would think about as social networks, and that would be Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest, etc. Then community platforms like Lithium and Jive. For example, if you have lots of companies would have like a Lithium or Jive, or there are other community platforms that generate social data, posts and comments and vote ups and vote down and all that sort of thing. And then there's enterprise collaboration, which is things like Yammer and Chatter and also Jive to some extent. So any kind of internal enterprise social network. All of those types of platforms are creating social data, whether they're external to the community or they're internal to the company. Then beyond that, or underneath that, we have a kind of quickly evolving market around social data platforms. Now, these are companies that are actually in the business of taking and reselling social data to other companies. And so the companies that fit into that category, and you can find them actually if you want to go to the Twitter certified products page, you can see this. Companies like GNIP in Boulder, Colorado, DataSift in San Francisco, California, Topsy, I believe, I can't remember where they're based, and then NTT is actually doing this in Japan for Japanese data. And what they do is they take the data from the various platforms. They have deep, in many cases, very deep integrations at the fire hose level. In some cases, for example, with Pinterest that doesn't have a public API, they may take a different point of view. And some of these companies, some of these 4 companies actually will enrich the data, filter it for spam, enrich it with demographic information to the extent that they're able to do that, and provide value-added services on top. They make that available on the left side to the social applications. That would be the listening platforms. That would be social media management systems. So listening platforms, for example, Radian6, Crimson Hexagon, NetBase, on and on. Engagement such as Hootsuite, Spreadfast, Sprinkler, etc. Then there would be the publishing platforms like Wildfire, which is now Google, or Buddy Media, which is now Salesforce, OfferPop, lots of the different social campaign development platforms. And then underneath that, ideally, really is the analytics for all of those things. It tells you kind of how things are performing. On the enterprise side, of course, we're starting to see CRM players begin to want to suck in some social data. So you can understand, for example, that somebody who called on your 800 number has also been tweeting about the same issue. BI, because they want to triangulate the data and understand, do social signals actually indicate propensity to buy or churn? market research, and on and on. So there are lots of different places, and eventually we'll even get to sensor data here, where we'll start to understand if it's a pharma company, is there a correlation between sensor data and social data? Is there a correlation between reported data and the spontaneously generated stuff we see in social networks? So this is actually a hyper simplification of a lot of stuff that's going on, but I just wanted to try to put it in context for you, because a lot of times when we think about social data, what we think about is at the bottom very left corner here, which is around the listening platforms, and there's a whole lot more. So let me give you a case study that kind of makes this come to life a little bit. There's a company called Parasol. They are a holding company for a bunch of restaurants, and they have a steakhouse called Manny's, very nice high-end steakhouse. And they were starting to get some word-of-mouth reports that people were leaving the restaurant and not entirely happy with their meal. And they were kind of curious to see whether there was something going on, but they couldn't really tell. And so what they did was they took their listening tool, in this case they were using New Brand Analytics, I believe, and they went to see, is there something in social data that will help us understand what's happening in terms of service or in terms of product quality at the company. And I want to use this example because this is a classic social data use case, but it's also a classic big data use case, because when you imagine the number of comments, this is a steakhouse, so we're not talking about huge big data, but if you were talking about something like a Procter & Gamble product or Coca-Cola or a car recall, then you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of social data points. So in this case, what they did was they looked at the social data. They were able to discover kind of an interesting thing, which was that it was clustering around certain geographies. And they were starting to see that there seemed to be kind of some hotspots in terms of where they were seeing these complaints. And when they looked at it, they discovered that those 6 hotspots correspond with a particular supplier they used for their beef. And this is a company that spends like $1 million a year on steak. So, it's a pretty significant investment for them. And so they lined it up. They looked at the samples from those 6 areas from that one supplier. They tasted them, and they discovered that the meat was just not up to the quality that they had previously experienced. And the supplier had done a bit of a bait and switch on them. And so they fired the supplier, they retrained their staff, and on and on. But, when you think about this, and this is the great thing about this case study as a big data case study, is that this could have gone on for weeks, if not months. And when you're a restaurant who defines yourself by the quality of that, in many cases $30 or $40 piece of steak that comes to you on a plate, that's what people are coming for. They're coming for that experience, but they're coming for the product quality. And for that to go on for weeks or months could have been a brand killer for them. And so the speed at which they were able to address the issue was fantastic. Now, the thing I will caution you about is that this is not scalable yet. And so hold that thought, because we're going to talk a little bit about scalability as we go. So in the research that I did for the Social Data Intelligence Report, I wanted to try to understand where people are in terms of using data. And clearly, as you've seen so far, there's some really interesting examples of how people are using social data in the context of other data sources, and how that kind of big data asset is helping them see things they may not have seen otherwise. So I came up with a definition here, and the important piece is that it's not just volumes of likes and shares and followers and fans. It's not just those volume metrics, which some people call vanity metrics, because you always have a beautiful chart that goes up and to the right, but it's intelligence, it's insight that is derived from social data that you can use, and here are the kickers, confidently, so you have to have a confidence level in the data that you get, and at scale, which is the hardest part, because in this Parasol case it was highly manual, and in conjunction with other data sources, in this case market research and word of mouth, to make strategic decisions. And if you think about it, the idea that a company would make a decision like firing a supplier based on social data a few years ago would have been kind of unheard of. So the big question is, what does this have to do with canaries? Well, if any of you who know anything about mining know that back in the day, coal miners would put a canary in a cage and they would send it down a coal mine. And the reason that they would send it down a coal mine is they wanted to make sure the air quality was good enough for humans to breathe and wasn't going to present an issue. And if the canary came up singing, you heard the canary singing, that was a good thing. If you didn't hear the canary was dead when you brought it up, that wasn't so good in terms of your air quality. So, so the three words, that describe the life of the canary is short but meaningful. Meaningful because it gives you a signal about the health of the work environment. And the reason that this kind of has to do with social data is that if you are building an organization that can actually extract value and, let's hope at scale one day, but extract value from social data that's used to make decisions, then that social media program is your canary in the coal mine. Because if you can make social data operational and meaningful and insightful in your organization, then you should be able to do the same with other big data streams. And that's kind of the story about why social data is the canary in the coal mine. One thing that happens when I speak with audiences, at conferences or other places around this sort of social data canary thing, is that a lot of marketers and people who come out of traditional social media and marketing and digital backgrounds don't necessarily in their daily lives have a lot to do with, what we think of as big data. This is why in the Strata talk that I'm going to give, it's very much around the data-driven business, and this is a data-driven business story. And so they don't necessarily think in terms of big data, but the truth is if you're doing social data, you're doing big data. And that actually can open up a really nice conversation, and probably a difficult one, but an important one, between the marketing or social media or digital team and the IT team, because all of a sudden you're looking at social as an asset that has value across the enterprise. So yes, it's challenging. It's challenging for a lot of reasons, but I want to give you kind of three of the key reasons here. The first is you have a lot of stakeholders to deal with. You have at least 13. You probably have more. And everybody's going to have a different point of view about the value and veracity and everything else of the data that you're dealing with. Somebody in marketing may see something as a sort of neutral post. The same tweet, for example, could be viewed in many different ways. Legal could find it alarming because maybe there's a tort claim or a risk of litigation. HR might say, well, the content is fine, but the person who posted it wasn't supposed to post. And so for that reason, it's negative. And so you've got a lot of different people who both have, who are customers of the data, either today or later, will be customers. And then they have a lot of conflicting interests. And so that's something that breaks silos across the organization. And this is another reason why social data is really the canary for big data, because if you can start to create those cross-organizational communication lines, then you can start to reap the benefit, first of social data and then any other data stream, big data stream that you choose to include. The next thing is that big data requires different analytical approaches. The interesting thing, I told you the 3 V's definition, but the interesting thing about this is that, all of the data in your organization that sits in a database, like you determined or somebody in your organization determined what data do we need and how are we going to store it. So whether it's, for example, a customer profile, name, address, social security number, phone number, email, etc., these are all bounded queries that sit in a database. They have very specific kind of syntax that they follow. And when you think about social data, social data could be, I have some funny, there's some funny examples, but like just imagine that the entire universe of social data that includes signals about your business also includes, stuff about the guy who spent $100,000 on plastic surgery so he could look like Justin Bieber, or every time that Miley Cyrus, does something in public, or stuff about the government shutdown, or in our case in the Bay Area, the BART strike. There's a ton of irrelevancy. And so you need to have new analytical approaches to filter what you have in a way that your organization can use it. And not just to filter it for relevance, but to filter it for tone and for actionability and various things. So I'll show you a really cool case study about that in a minute. And then the third thing is that social data, sometimes the analysts who work with it, lack enterprise credibility. And the reason is the 3 V's, the volume, variety, velocity, brain spasm, those 3 things actually make the data much harder to work with. And so as a result, people, and you think about something like sentiment analysis, and people are not convinced of its veracity. Sometimes people use a 4th V, veracity, because sentiment analysis is very inexact, can be very inexact. And so the credibility issue is big because there are no standards yet. There may not ever be standards that are industry-wide because the value, let's say, of a share, or let's say the value of something like from a web analytics point of view, of time on site. If you're Zappos, the fact that somebody spent an hour or 20 minutes or 3 minutes on your site is kind of cool, right? It's nice. People are spending time. Maybe they're engaging with your content, and that's great. But there's no business outcome there. The fact that they sat there doesn't really mean a lot unless they go buy something. Whereas if you're CNN or you're the New York Times or you're Huffington Post, time on site, if you're a media company, time on site is critical. It's money in the bank because that's where advertising revenue comes from, the fact that you can say to a certainty that you can keep people on your site. So it's all kind of coming together now, and we're very much at the beginning. So let's go into a few characteristics of social data that you should consider. And I think that as we start to see other big data streams that become kind of, let's say, more common in enterprise, we're going to have to start to break them down because they don't come in beautifully packaged form. They're a little bit of a mess. So look at the content type. Is it an image? Is it a video? Is it a natural language post? All those things, or a like or a share, all those things are different. It's not the same as an address in an address field. The social action type, is it a +1 or a share? For example, if you tweet something, it goes by pretty quickly in your followers' newsfeed. If you pin something on Pinterest, it's there forever, which leads you to content lifespan. Some things are very ephemeral. Some things are very permanent. For example, blog posts are more permanent. Then there's the platform demographic. And just because social data is now representative of, the vast majority of the world these days, it doesn't mean that there aren't demographic differences. So, for example, if you're a sporting goods company and you're trying to reach teenage skateboarders, you're probably not going to use Facebook because they're not really there for that. You may not use Twitter even. You might be just completely focused on something like Instagram. Or even Snapchat, God forbid, because that's a data person's nightmare. Then there's the type of user relationship. You see very tight relationships on Facebook because people tend to be friends, or at least sort of, Facebook friends. But then different on YouTube, right? Because people don't necessarily know who each other are. And if you think about, if you want to think about the extremes, think about something like Path, where everybody, tends to be. You can only have, I think, 150 friends, and it tends to be a tight relationship, versus Reddit, which is just a free-for-all. And that can really change the tone of comments, as any of you who have ever looked at Reddit comments can attest to. Then there are the data types. There's structured data, which is like a +1 or a share, or something that is a structured piece of data. It's the same every single time. Versus an unstructured piece of data, which is somebody saying, I love Bieber with 18 exclamation points. That has to be interpreted. And then finally, there's location awareness. If you're using Foursquare, your location is always evident. If you're using Twitter, your location is evident a small percentage of the time, or Facebook, because you have to opt in to share that location. So let's talk about actionability. One of the things I think is really important with social data is having a clear sense of why you're doing what you're doing and how it maps to business goals. So if you look at this compass, this I developed in 2011 based on interviews with a whole bunch of companies, both technology companies and sort of end users of technology. And there are really 6 main use cases that we found. What can social data help? It can help us understand how people see our brand. It can help us understand if our marketing programs are performing and how to invest in marketing. It can help us, in some cases, generate revenue opportunity, either by awareness generation or consideration, or in some cases even conversion. It can help us with operational efficiency as we move people from, for example, very high cost call center calls that could be, say, $6 to $10 per call, to a much lower cost digital interaction that could be maybe 10 cents per interaction, or helps us understand, for example, fraud or other types of risks that we didn't see. Then there's the whole customer experience piece, which, Comcast, I would say Frank Eliason is kind of the champion, who used to be at Comcast, who's kind of the champion of this, the idea that if you have this public voice, if you listen to your customers, you can improve the experience. Even if it's still a frustrating experience, people feel heard. And then finally, there's innovation, and that could be as simple as generating ideas. What would you like to see? Looking at the way that people talk about your product when they say, I wish that my fuel band did this, or I wish that my Toyota Prius did that, or actually understanding product issues that need to be fixed. So that's the business goal piece. The second step is to figure out, okay, so if my goal is brand health, then maybe I look at brand sentiment over time to see as a proxy. None of these things are perfect, by the way, and they all require a lot of scientific analysis to really understand the relationships. Some of them are easier than others, I will be honest with you. So for example, conversion works beautifully if you've got conversion attribution software, if you've got people operating more or less on the same browser, on the same device, and if you're able to track that link from the first piece to the final purchase. And also, frankly, if you've got the kind of experience in which people tend to buy quickly. So for example, if you get a link on Twitter or Facebook or somewhere that brings you to a page, you click on that link, you go to the page says get 10% off or 5% off, or today you get a special discount, you go and you buy. That's very clear. But if you go ahead and pin something to your Pinterest board, whether it's let's say wallpaper, you might not be redecorating your house until the spring. And so the cause versus effect piece is much harder to gauge. But it's important to at least have that conversation and ask those kind of thought experiment type of questions. If we really want to use social or understand the impact of social on innovation, how could we calculate that? Does it help us get to market faster? Here's a little process for this. I've included a link. You can actually download this Excel spreadsheet to start prioritizing. And the idea would be you look at the value of your metric, you look at the capability your organization has to deliver it, you look at the resources it requires, and then you look at how dependent other things are on it. So as an example, the third from the bottom, if you look at revenue generation and you look at the impact of social on conversion, incredibly high value. Anybody who can say our social media program means that people who engage with us on social media are twice as likely to buy, that's enterprise goals right there. However, if you don't have the right tools, then you're going to be looking at a 1, for the capability, because you can't. It may be the holy grail, but you can't get to it. And so you start tweaking these numbers, preferably in a team of people who are stakeholders. And then you can force rank what you're able to do today versus what you may need to invest in to do later. So I want to talk now about a case study that I think is really just incredibly helpful for organizations who are trying to make sense of social media. And one of the things I think is important here as it relates to big data is the idea that social data is this big sort of morass of stuff. But Symantec has taken a very operational approach to it. And what I mean by that is that they sat down and they said, okay, we are going to look at social data and we're going to characterize this social data into things that we need to care about and things that we don't. Things that we don't, let's just forget. Things that we do, we're going to call them actionable internet mentions, or AIMs. And that is, and so then they sat down and they said, okay, well, what are all the different things we might have to take action on? And they came up with 7 categories. Actually, they came up with 6, but I'll tell you what the 7th is all about. So the first was a case, meaning my doohickey is broken, I need help. The second was a query. I have a question, but it doesn't require any kind of entry into the CRM system. It might be a password reset, let's say, something like that. Then there's a rant. I hate you, here's why I hate you, and somebody needs to deal with that. Somebody needs to ask if they can help or if they can fix the problem. Then there is the rave. I love you. I think you're fantastic. And that requires, for graciousness' sake, somebody to say thank you so much and maybe even think about that person as a potential future advocate. And then there is a lead. I'm thinking about buying, a new hybrid car. Should I get a Nissan Leaf? Should I get a Toyota Prius? What should I do? That might prompt somebody to contact that person or to ask if they can be of assistance. And that could actually end up in the lead management system. Then there's an RFE, which is a request for enhancement. I wish your product did this or that. They actually collect those and send them to their product development team, and the product development team will actually go through and do a feasibility study on those and force rank them, and the ones that are implemented are actually, they communicate back. Then the 7th one, which was kind of the surprise, the gift to the legal department, was that they started, when they were looking at social data, finding all of these instances of illegal downloads. And so this was something nobody expected. I mean, they knew that there was fraud, but they didn't know that actually using social data was going to enable them to find so much stuff they didn't even know about. So if you think about the idea of a security company using social media, it doesn't really immediately stand to reason that the legal team's going to be really excited about that. But in this case, Symantec was actually able to thrill the legal team because it saved them a lot of work and it reduced a lot of risk. So, they didn't give us specific numbers because, that's not something they were able to do. But just to give you these 4 categories, this is really the result that they're able to see, to the point where, they feel that this investment is worthwhile. And what I want to kind of emphasize about this example is that this is a classic big data use case, taking this kind of big morass of stuff, adding some structure to it, and then from there clarifying what the business objectives and opportunities were and results were, and then sharing that across the enterprise. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about how you get to maturity and how you build a data-driven organization. This is a model, a maturity map from the Social Data Intelligence Report that actually is the foundation for this talk today. And it's a busy graphic, so I want to just walk you through really what it means. As we've spoken to all these different organizations, what we've found is that they really fall into 4 categories, really 3 categories because the 4th is more aspirational, but 3 categories today in terms of how they're using social data and how they are kind of organized around these 6 dimensions. And so the first stage in terms of social data is ad hoc. So, from a kind of scope point of view, it's maybe 1 or 2 departments who are involved in dealing with it. They don't necessarily know how to map it back to business objectives. There might not be a lot of context. When you do a classic marketing program, let's say you do an ad buy or you do a TV spot, you have a pretty good sense of what your numbers are going to look like, even if you want to quibble with what Nielsen ratings are and all that sort of thing. It's a known quantity. Then governance, how to do those processes. But in this case with social data, the governance processes are pretty new. And who's responsible? A lot of the social media management have governance built in the sense that there are business rules in some of them, like Hearsay Social, or they're developing business rules to govern what can be published. or there's a clear audit trail that person A sent something to person B who now needs to enter it into the CRM system, and it becomes a case that must be closed. But in a lot of cases, these new processes for dealing with the social data are kind of ad hoc, and there's a lot of cut and paste and Excel going on. And then you talk about the metrics. Well, how do we measure it? And then the data, do we understand it? One of the just key issues with data that actually got me into this business in the first place is things like, do you know what percentage of Twitter you're actually getting? If you're B2B and you're getting 1% through the Twitter public API, you may be missing a lot of mentions of your product, because if you have a low volume niche type of market, low volume of conversations, let's say you're talking about something like, health insurance is huge right now, but something like, your car insurance. That might be, people don't maybe talk about that quite as much on Twitter as they talk about entertainment, right? So you want to make sure that you're getting a decent set. So ad hoc is very much a learning stage, and there's the incredible value to it as long as you're learning. In the formalized stage, the real difference here is that stuff is getting formalized, yes, but the most important piece is you're starting to map your social data program to your business objectives. Now, keep in mind that data streams are going to come irrespective of whether every implication of that data stream has been thought out. So if you're a company that creates a medical device, let's say something to test insulin levels, or a Fitbit, or a Jawbone Up, or a Nike Fuel Band, that's sensor data. And that data may, or frankly, in your, if you buy a new refrigerator and it has Wi-Fi in it, as some of them do, and the idea is they know how many times you opened your freezer in a given day. Those are things that could actually have an impact on your warranty down the line. So the importance here is you need to kind of take that social data stream or other type of big data stream, and you need to map it to your business objectives. We have the data. Do we understand how we're going to use it and what it means? And then once you do that, the next stage is you got to integrate it, because if it's sitting there all by itself in your Radian 6 or your Crimson Hexagon or something else, and it's disconnected from the rest of your business, then it's lovely, but it's a cost center. And so, your customers may be talking about something in social media. For example, if you're a satellite TV or cable provider, you may have an outage somewhere, and people are talking about it. But if you don't have a connection between what's going on there and your call center, you may be missing the opportunity to actually get out in front of that issue before it becomes a crisis. So the third stage is around that integration, that process of connecting the data with other pieces of information in the enterprise that actually give you context into what's going on. That's kind of, in some ways, I would say Symantec falls between the formalized and integrated place, because they are manually integrating a lot of things. However, nobody's at holistic, because, frankly, we just aren't there as an industry yet. Nobody can do this. The technology isn't good enough yet. It's not mature enough yet, because the big difference between 3 and 4, you have to do it at scale, and nobody can do it at scale yet. So, not to make you cry or anything, but that's kind of the reality of it. This is an aspirational case study, because I want to paint a picture of where we go with this when we can start to take all these different data streams and sort of bring them together for this unified view. And so if you think about Caesars, what's interesting about them is it's not just the casinos. It's the hotels, the casinos, the golf courses, and the restaurants. And then it's 50 plus, right, different properties. And so if I walk in and I really, couldn't care less about the golf course, but I love the restaurant and I love the hotel shops, my experience might be really different from somebody else's who's a big golfer. And so the idea is they want to start to connect all these different data streams together so that they can have that online, offline touch point mapped out across things like, online and offline advertising, display, email, organic search, affiliate, segments, media types, brands. So the idea is that, in the future, it's not just that I get a slightly different view when I come in, but that my experience based on the data has been customized for me. And so that's kind of where this is going. And I won't say that they've accomplished this, but they're certainly on the path. And this is their goal. This is a big, BHAG, right? A big, hairy, what goal. But they want to understand that journey. They want to extract the insight. They want to use that to build preference models. And then they want to use that to drive loyalty. And really, what else is there? And so I think, when you think about all the other pieces of data that could come in, this starts to give you a sense as to how social can be, a dress rehearsal or the canary in the coal mine or big data, or other types of big data. So some final thoughts here. The first thing is, I want to think about, if we could kind of stop for a second in our crazy work lives and just take a breath. One of the things I think is such an interesting potential for all of this big data stuff is, what if we could flip our point of view? And what if we could think not from the organization out? In other words, well, I can't do that because that requires CRM, and then I have to talk to customer service, and that's a whole other thing because I have to get Joe involved, and Joe's traveling, and I have to deal with market research. But what if we flipped our point of view and we just said, what if in a perfect world we started from the customer and then we engineered in? And to some degree, that's really what Caesars is trying to do. They're trying to kind of use the data to flip the point of view from what can we do pragmatically in the organization to, in a perfect world, how would we organize if we really put the customer at the center? It's not all possible. I mean, let's be honest. This is not the unicorn and rainbows, talk. But it is, I think, an important thought experiment around how would that change the way we gather information, the way we share information, and the way we interact with our customers. The second thing is, I've already said, big data's here. You're already doing it. If you're on this call, you're probably already doing this at some degree or another. You're involved in a big data initiative. That may be social data, it may be sensor, it may be transactional e-commerce, it may be any, lots of different options. But the reality is, we're in a data-driven world. That leads to what several people call the hippo phenomenon. The hippo phenomenon, which I didn't make up. There was a fantastic article in Harvard Business Review late last year around how big data disrupts culture. And what they and so what I mean by that is, when you have a lot of data, you have a lot of radical transparency, meaning that in the organization of today, if you think about what happened in that Barilla situation a few weeks ago, where the CEO made some comments about, gays in advertising, that thing, lit on fire very, very quickly. If it happened 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, what would happen in an organization like that is a bunch of CorpCom people would get in a war room with some executives, and they'd figure it out more or less in private, because it would have been a fairly, let's say, it would have been a somewhat addressable situation. It would have been embarrassing, it would have been crisis, but it wouldn't have taken over the entire universe. But big data, social data, makes everything as clear or clearer to your end users and customers as it does to your executives. And sometimes, frankly, your customers know first that something's happening. So what does this have to do with HIPPOs? HIPPO stands for the classic way that decisions are made in organizations, and that is the highest paid person's opinion. That is what HIPPO stands for. What we do, you ask the highest paid person in the room. That person uses their depth of experience and their, the mystique of being the boss. They make a decision. What happens when the data contradicts that person? What happens when the person says, we really need to really need to build, a flying car, and the data says, well, that's fine, but nobody's asking for a flying car. And so that disrupts culture. How do you deal with that? Finally, if all that weren't enough, not to scare you, you've heard about real-time enterprise. You've heard about right-time enterprise, which is real-time at the right time. You've heard that all this stuff is coming faster and faster and faster. And if you pay attention to a little bit about what SAP and others are doing around the HANA work that they're doing, the ability to deliver data at the point of action, it means that there's more and more pressure to actually be able to respond to that data, because the fact that you can deliver real-time data doesn't really help if you can't deal with it. And so those are kind of 4 things that I wanted to leave you with in terms of what this is going to look like in the next few years. The important thing here, and the reason I call this the Canary and the Coalmine talk, is that if you can create the governance, the processes, the resources, the capabilities, the lines of communication to deal with social data, then you will have that as an infrastructure. And most importantly, the lines of communication, frankly, between groups like marketing and support and IT. There's never been higher stakes for that. And if you can do that now, then when other types of big data start to come along, you will have an infrastructure that enables you to support it. And if I look at what Symantec is doing today, I think they're pretty well organized in terms of the fact that they've got a way. It may not be perfect. It may not, maybe high maintenance, but they have a way of dealing with it. And I think that's really, really important. And so I just want to encourage all of you to think big and think long term, and then, of course, also think pragmatically, because this is, we're kind of, the future is here, folks, and we are all dealing with it. So with that, I am happy to take some questions, and thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Susan. Excellent, excellent presentation. Folks, we are at Q&A. If you haven't opened that group chat, please do. Open it, type your question, and send it in, and we'll take as many as we have time for. Okay, we do have a question from Chris who would like to know, how are companies dealing with PII in their work and social data?
So it's a great question. So PII stands for personally identifiable information. A lot of the PII challenge sits in the social platforms. We're talking about social data, so it sits in the terms of service in terms of how that data is handled. It's a really complicated answer because the companies that I speak to, they are if you're, let's say, a beer company and you can't market to minors, or you are any kind of company really, and you're collecting information on minors, I mean, that's a federal offense. It's a really huge issue. And so a lot of the challenge here is in the way that the social platforms are constructed. Now that Facebook is enabling more public access, access for minors, for example, that means that companies are going to have to rewrite their data collection methods. But, so I can't answer from a technical standpoint how they're doing it, but I will tell you that it is at the top of everybody's list, and nobody wants to be collecting anything that they shouldn't be collecting. Downstream, the impact is that if a minor is, if a minor is posting, for example, on Twitter, and somebody's collecting and responding to that, then they have to go through a process of understanding whether the person that they're dealing with is actually, first of all, giving them information they don't want, because the last thing they want is to have that information sitting somewhere within their database. And they also have to make sure that they are following, that they're following terms of service. So it's tricky. The whole thing is tricky, but I will say that it is absolutely top of mind for everybody that I'm talking to. And the last thing anybody wants to do is get into that morass.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan. We'll just give folks another moment here to send in their questions. And folks, while you're going to type that question and send it in for us here, we just want to let you all know that next week, October 28th through the 30th, is O'Reilly Strata Conference and Hadoop World. The conference is sold out, and for those of you that are not able to make it there, we are going to be live streaming all the keynotes and some of the sessions, so you can watch them on O'Reilly.com. It'll be right there on the home page, so we do hope you take advantage of that. Let's see here. We've also pushed out information to you on Susan's session that she's going to be talking at. So for those of you that are at the conference, we do hope you attend her session and stop by, shake her hand, and introduce yourself. Let's see here, Susan. I'm not seeing additional questions. So with that, we're going to say a very, very big thank you to you, Susan, for presenting today's webcast. It was very informative, and we thank you for sharing all your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And see if you can pop by and say hi at Strata if you're there.
Great. And folks, we'd also like to say a very big thank you to Informatica for sponsoring today's webcast and let you all know that Informatica is the world's #1 independent provider of data integration software. Organizations rely on Informatica to realize their information potential and drive their top business imperatives. Informatica Vibe, the industry's first and only embeddable virtual data machine, powers the unique Map Once, Deploy Everywhere capabilities of the Informatica platform. Vibe harnesses data in every application, every process, for every person and in every device in the world. Organizations around the globe depend on Informatica to fully leverage their information assets from devices to mobile, to social, to big data residing on-premise, in the cloud, and across social networks. Thank you again, Informatica. And folks, you can visit them at the kiosk number 63 at the conference. Thank you again, Susan. Thank you, everyone that attended. This will conclude our webcast today. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.